Most people who want to grow more of their own food start the same way. Spring arrives, you pick up some seeds or starts, you get them in the ground, you tend to them through the season, and if things go well, you harvest something. And then the season ends. The plants die back. The beds sit empty. And come next spring, you're doing the exact same thing again, buying seeds, prepping the same soil, starting over from zero. That cycle is normal. It's what modern food culture expects from gardeners, but it isn't the only option. And for a lot of people, it's not actually the most practical one. There's a different category of food plants that most home growers never fully explore. Plants that you establish once and that return year after year. With far less intervention from you, the root systems deepen with each season, the canopy fills in. The harvest comes reliably, without replanting, without starting over. These are perennial food plants, and most of the productive ones never make it onto mainstream gardening lists. Today we're covering 5 of them, not the obvious ones. The 5 that serious food gardeners quietly rely on, but that get almost no attention in popular garden media. If you're thinking seriously about long-term food production, about building something that keeps producing instead of needing to be rebuilt every year, these are worth understanding. Let's talk about why they're overlooked in the first place, and then we'll go through each one. The framework that gives context to all 5 of these plants is something called a food forest, sometimes referred to as a forest garden. It's a design approach that structures food plants the way a natural woodland would organize itself, with multiple layers working together in the same space. At the top, you have larger canopy trees. Below that, smaller fruit trees and large fruiting shrubs occupy the understory layer. Closer to the ground, you have herbaceous plants, ground covers, and root crops. The concept is vertical stacking using the full height of a planting area, rather than just one flat layer of annual vegetables. What makes this system different from a conventional garden isn't just the design, it's the time horizon. Because most of the plants are perennial, each growing season builds on the previous one. The system doesn't reset, it accumulates. Over time, the soil improves, the root networks expand, and the plants produce more consistently, not less. Community food forests operating on this model have demonstrated that a well-chosen combination of perennial species can provide edible fruits, nuts, and vegetables from a relatively compact space with significantly lower annual labor than a garden that replants each year. The 5 plants we're covering today all belong to the understory layer of this kind of system. They're shrubs or small fruiting plants. They're adapted to temperate climates. They're established in food forest plantings across the upper Midwest and similar regions. And they're all significantly underused compared to how productive and low maintenance they actually are. Let's start with honeyberry. Honeyberry, also known as haskap, is a hardy fruiting shrub that produces small, elongated blueberries in late spring, typically earlier in the season than most other fruiting plants in the same garden. If you haven't come across it, that's not surprising. It hasn't broken through into mainstream gardening culture in most parts of the United States, even though it's well established in food forest plantings and has been used as a food plant in colder climates for a long time. What makes honeyberry genuinely worth considering comes down to a few things. First, it's cold hardy in a way that most fruiting plants simply aren't. It can handle serious winters without significant damage, which makes it a reliable option where other fruiting shrubs might struggle. Second, that early harvest window is actually useful. When honeyberry is producing in late spring, most other food plants are still months away from bearing anything. Having something edible that early in the season matters if you're thinking about a food system that provides throughout the year, not just in late summer. Third, and this is what places it firmly in the perennial food system category, once established, honeyberry is low demand. It doesn't need annual replanting. It doesn't require intensive inputs. It settles into the understory layer, it grows, and it produces. The berries themselves are tart and flavorful, often described as somewhere between blueberry and black currant. They work fresh, dried, in preserves, or baked. One practical note, honeyberry benefits from cross-pollination, so it's worth planting more than one variety if you want consistent fruit production. Most plants will reach 4 to 6 feet at maturity, which makes them a natural fit under larger canopy trees without competing aggressively for light, as long as they're positioned with adequate sun access. Honeyberry doesn't come with a dramatic reputation. It's not a plant with a famous history or a bold flavor that demands attention. It's just a productive, cold-hardy, low-maintenance shrub that fits the understory layer of a perennial food system well, and delivers a harvest almost nothing else can cover that early in the season. That quiet reliability is exactly the point. The second plant on this list is Juneberry, also called Serviceberry depending on where you are. It's a small native tree or large shrub. The line between the two depends on how you prune and manage it, and it produces clusters of small round berries in early summer, typically in June, which is where the common name comes from. Juneberry occupies the same understory position as Honeyberry, but it grows taller, often reaching 8 to 15 feet, which gives it a slightly different role in a layered food system. It can act as a bridge between ground-level plantings and full canopy trees, adding structure to the space while contributing a reliable fruit harvest. The berries have a mild, sweet flavor, sometimes compared to blueberries, with a faint almond quality from the small seeds. They work fresh, dried, or preserved. Birds tend to find them before you do, which is worth knowing up front. Netting helps if your harvest is a priority. What makes Juneberry stand out in the context of a perennial food system is its adaptability. It handles a wide range of conditions: part shade, heavier soils, colder winters without much complaint. It's a native species across much of North America, which means it's genuinely suited to the environment rather than being pushed into it. That matters for long-term establishment. Plants that belong in a region tend to need less support from the gardener over time. Once a Juneberry is established, it asks for very little. It doesn't need annual attention to keep producing. It doesn't need replanting. It fills its layer in the system, it fruits reliably, and it's there season after season. For a plant that gets almost no mention in most backyard gardening conversations, the track record is worth paying attention to. The third plant is Aronia, commonly called black chokeberry. The name doesn't do it any favors, which is probably part of why it's overlooked. Chokeberry sounds like a warning rather than an invitation. But set that aside, because Aronia is one of the most productive and low-maintenance fruiting shrubs you can put into a perennial system. The berries are dark purple-black and intensely astringent eaten fresh, hence the name. But cooked, dried, or processed into juice and preserves, that astringency converts into a deep, complex flavor that works well in a wide range of preparations. Aronia has a long history of use as a food plant in Eastern Europe, where it's processed commercially at scale. In North American home-growing contexts, it's largely absent despite being perfectly suited to the climate. Here's what matters practically. Aronia is tough. It handles cold winters, wet soils, compacted ground, and neglect better than almost anything else in the shrub layer. It doesn't have significant pest problems. It doesn't need coddling. It grows, it produces, and it requires very little from you in return. For anyone building a food system that's meant to function with lower inputs over the long term, Aronia belongs in that system. The harvest is real and usable. The maintenance is minimal. The longevity is there. The only thing it was missing was a better reputation, and that's starting to shift as more growers discover how practical it actually is. The fourth plant is Nanking cherry, a compact fruiting shrub that most people have never heard of, despite the fact that it produces heavily, establishes quickly, and handles difficult growing conditions without significant intervention. Nanking cherry grows to about 6 to 8 feet and bears small red cherries in early to midsummer. The fruit is tart and juicy, closer in character to a sour cherry than a sweet one, which makes it particularly well suited to preserves, syrups, and baked applications rather than fresh eating. For food production purposes, that's actually useful. Processed preserves have longer shelf life and higher caloric density than fresh fruit, which aligns well with the food security framing of a perennial system. What sets Nanking cherry apart is how early it starts producing. Unlike many perennials that need 2 or 3 seasons before they're ready to harvest, Nanking cherry often begins fruiting in its second year. for growers who want to start seeing returns from their perennial investment without waiting years. That early productivity matters. It also tolerates cold winters and dry spells better than most fruiting plants. In its size class, it's not a dramatic plant. It doesn't have a flashy presence in the garden, but it does something quietly important. It produces real food reliably from a shrub that takes up a modest amount of space and asks for very little in return. That's the profile you're looking for when you're building a system that's supposed to function without constant intervention. The fifth plant is currants, either black, red, or white varieties, all of which are more productive and more practical in a home food system than most growers realize. Currants are compact shrubs, typically reaching 4 to 5 feet, and they produce dense clusters of small berries across the length of their branches in midsummer. A mature, well-situated currant bush can yield several pounds of fruit per season, and it does so consistently. Why across many years? The plants are cold-hardy, shade-tolerant compared to most fruiting shrubs, and they don't require the same level of sunshine that apples or peaches demand. That shade tolerance makes them genuinely flexible in how you position them in a layered system. They can occupy spots that other fruiting plants can't. Black currants have the most intense flavor of the three, rich, complex, and tart, with an earthy depth that distinguishes them clearly from anything you'd find in a grocery store. Red and white currants are milder and work well fresh or in lighter preparations. All three process beautifully into preserves, juices, and dried fruit. There's a practical dimension to currants that deserves emphasis. They're among the most efficient fruiting plants for small spaces. High yield relative to footprint, adaptable light requirements, cold hardiness, and long productive lifespan add up to a plant that quietly delivers a lot over time, without demanding much attention once it's settled in. Now, stepping back, across all 5 plants, Honeyberry, Juneberry, Aronia, Nanking cherry, currants, a pattern becomes clear. None of them are exotic. None of them require unusual skills or specialized conditions. What they share is a set of qualities that align directly with what a long-term food system actually needs: cold hardiness, low annual maintenance, consistent yields, adaptability, and longevity. The reason these plants don't appear on every gardening list isn't that they're difficult or unreliable, it's that they don't fit the seasonal reset model that most garden media is built around. They don't need to be purchased again next spring. They don't generate the kind of annual seed and supply sales that annual vegetables do. They just grow, produce, and continue, which is precisely what makes them valuable. If you're thinking about your food garden, not as a seasonal project, but as a long-term system, something that builds on itself, deepens its roots, and becomes more productive over time rather than starting over from zero each year, these 5 plants belong in that plan. They're not the whole picture, but they're a solid, practical foundation for the understory layer of any perennial food system, and that's a layer that most home gardens are missing entirely. Start with 1. Get it established, let it settle in, and notice what it feels like to harvest from something that doesn't need you to restart it every spring. That's what a perennial food system actually delivers, not just food, but time back. If this kind of approach is something you want to keep building on, there's a lot more to cover. Subscribe and stay with us. We'll keep going deeper into the plants and systems that are worth your long-term investment.